In section 1.1, we discussed sampling. Sampling is the method that we use for collecting data, right? So once we collect a sample and survey the individuals within that sample, we have a set of information. And this information is called a data set. So in this section, we're going to explore what a data set is, some characteristics of that, and different types of data. So we'll explore that in a bit more detail. So here's our objectives. We will seek to understand the structure of a typical data set. We will distinguish between what we call qualitative and quantitative variables, and we'll also just define what a variable is. And then we'll distinguish between ordinal and nominal variables. And finally, we'll distinguish between discrete and continuous variables. So let's go ahead and get started with our first objective, which is to really understand the structure of a typical data set. So, like we said, we detailed the process of sampling in the previous section, right? So once we go through the sampling process, then we have to basically finalize our data set from the information that we collect from that sample. Now, typically when we are collecting or gathering a data set, we are focusing our study on some specific variables. Variables are really basically any characteristic of the individuals in our sample. Okay, and these variables can have, each variable will have specific values. So if the individuals in our sample are people, then the variables might be things like age, or they could be things like gender. If the population is, say, a population of college students, then a variable could be like class standing of freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. Really any characteristic of an individual is called a variable, right? And then the values of the variables really are just the values assigned for each individual, right? So if the variable is age, then the values would just be the ages of the individuals in our sample, right? If the if the variable is gender, then the values would just be basically assigning either male, female to each individual within the sample, and so on. Okay, so that's what variables are. The information that we collect is basically just the specific values of the individual variables, right? And then the final set of information, we call that a data set. So, explore this a bit more. Let's move on to our next objective. Variables can really come in two types. The two types of variables are qualitative and quantitative. So let's break this down. Qualitative variables. These are variables that classify individuals into categories. So like if the variable is class standing among college students, the categories would be freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, right? If the variable is gender, the categories could be male, female, and so on, right? Quantitative variables tell us how much or how many of something there is. So it's a quantitative variable. The value of the variable is going to be a number that represents a quantity, right? So age would be an example of a quantitative variable, right? Because it gives us a quantity, which is the number of years that correspond to how old a person is, and it's expressed as a number. So let's explore some other examples. Which of the following variables are qualitative and which are quantitative? The first two we've really already discussed. A person's age, this is quantitative because it tells how much time has elapsed since the person was born. A person's gender, this is qualitative because it consists of the categories male and female. The mileage of a car, this is quantitative because it tells how many miles a car will go on a certain amount of gasoline, right? So it's a quantity, it's expressed as a number. The color of a car, this is qualitative because it consists of the categories of different colors. Okay. Now, variables can be broken down even farther, right? So what we've said is that there are two types of variables, right? There are quantitative and qualitative. Qualitative variables can be broken down into two types as well, ordinal and nominal, right? So there's ordinal and nominal, and these are two types of qualitative variables. So let's define these terms. Qualitative variables can be further divided into ordinal and nominal. Ordinal variables have a very natural ordering to them. Okay, so the different category names, there's a way of arranging those names that just naturally makes sense. Nominal variables do not have a natural ordering. So let's illustrate this with some examples once again. Which of the following variables are ordinal and which are nominal? State of residence. Okay, this is qualitative because the categories would be the different state names, but it's nominal because there's no natural ordering. There's no natural way of arranging the state names. It just kind of naturally makes sense. Okay. Gender, again, qualitative, but it's nominal because, again, the different gender categories, there's not a natural ordering among those category names. But if we look at letter grade in a class, again, it's qualitative because the categories would be A, B, C, D, or F. And this would be ordinal because there is a natural ordering, right? If we arrange them in the order A, B, C, D, F, that makes sense, right? Because that arranges the grades from the best grade to the worst grade, okay? So that's a way of naturally arranging those category names that makes sense. Or similarly, size of a soft drink order at a fast food restaurant. This is a qualitative variable that may have the categories such as small, medium, large, extra large. And arranging the category names in that way is natural. It makes sense, right? Arranging them from the smallest size to the largest size, or largest to smallest would also be a natural way to order those. Okay. So that illustrates the difference between ordinal and nominal variables, which are both different types of qualitative variables. And now moving back over to quantitative variables, our next objective. Quantitative variables can also be subdivided into two different types, which would be discrete and continuous variables. Okay. Discrete variables. This is a situation where the possible values can be listed. Remember that the values associated with any quantitative variable will always be numbers, right? So if it's discrete, it would be a finite number of numbers, right? We can list them. Okay. Continuous variables, on the other hand, would be ones where the numerical value of the variable can take on any value within some interval, right? So in the case of a continuous variable, there's always an infinite number of possible values that the variable could be assigned as, right? And so it would be impossible to list all the possible values of a continuous variable. To illustrate the difference, again, let's look at some examples. Which of the following variables are discrete and which are continuous? Age of a person at his or her last birthday, right? The age of a person is exactly a certain number of years, right? 10 years, 5 years old, 25 years old, 39, right? It's it's always going to be a fixed discrete value. So this is an example of a discrete variable, right? Because ages at a person's birthday can be listed. Let's contrast that with something like height of a person. Height of a person is still a quantitative variable, right? Because height is something that is measured numerically as a number, right? But this is an example of a continuous variable because height can take on any value within some interval, right? Sure, there is an upper limit to how tall a person can be. We could say maybe about 7 feet. I don't know if, people, rarely a person might get that tall, but within a specific interval, right, there's an infinite number of possible values of what a height could be, right? It's not restricted to exactly 4 feet or exactly 5 feet or exactly 6 feet. It could be 5.5 feet or 5.378 feet, right? Or 4.29817, right? So if we think about that, there's a continuous spectrum of values that could potentially be a height, right? Height is not, there is a lower limit and an upper limit, but within that spectrum, within that interval, the height can be any value, right? It's not restricted to just certain discrete values. Number of siblings a person has, right? This is another example of a discrete random variable, right? Because the number of siblings can be listed. It's going to be a fixed discrete value. You have 2 siblings or 3 siblings or 5 siblings or 10 siblings, right? There may be there's going to be some variation there, but it's always a number, something you can count or list. And then finally, distance a person commutes to work. Again, this is another example of a continuous variable, right? Because again, similar to height, distance can take on any value within some interval, right? It's not restricted to just fixed values, like 10 miles or 20 miles or 30 miles. You could also have 20.5 miles or 18.379 miles, right? So distance can be a whole number, it can be a decimal number, it can be a fractional number, right? There's no restrictions on that. So there's an infinite number of possible values that could represent a distance, right? So that represents a continuous variable. So that wraps up this short section, right? We've looked at the structure of a data set, and then we've explored how to distinguish between qualitative and quantitative variables, ordinal and nominal variables, and discrete and continuous variables, right? And just to kind of break that, just to kind of, clarify things there again, right? Qualitative and quantitative represent the 2 types of variables, right? Ordinal and nominal are 2 different types of qualitative variables. Discrete and continuous would be the 2 different types of quantitative variables. So that's it for this section.